I'm Chuck Meide. I'm the director of the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, which is the research arm of the St. Augustine Lighthouse Maritime Museum.
And I'm Olivia McDaniel. I'm one of the archaeologists with the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program.
Well, we are here on the grounds of the St. Augustine Lighthouse Maritime Museum. We are in the keeper's house. So traditionally, this was the dwelling where the keeper and his family and the assistant keeper and his family lived. But of course, we have kind of transformed it from the 19th century to the 21st century. So it is now housing some of our exhibits, some of the great archaeological research that we have done. And the exhibit in here, we're particularly proud of. It's our brand new wrecked exhibit. So come get wrecked at the St. Augustine Lighthouse and Maritime Museum.
This research program does is we study the maritime history and underwater archaeology of the water directly surrounding St. Augustine and the whole First Coast region. And so this wreck was first found as part of a comprehensive remote sensing survey that was started in 2009. And so as part of those surveys, we used instruments like side scan sonars, which use sound wave technology to show us an image of things that stick up above the sand on the seafloor, and also instruments like marine magnetometers, which read the Earth's magnetic field and the fluctuations within it. And shipwrecks, which often have a lot of iron and other ferrous material on them, will have these magnetic signatures.
So once we found the shipwreck, we kind of made a determination like, hey, this is something of interest. This is a historic shipwreck. There are artifacts on here that are clearly old, and there seems to be a lot of stuff that we want to learn more about. So we're scientists, right? We use science to help answer these questions. What ship is this? How old is it? What was its purpose? What was its function? Who was on this ship? What's the nature of the shipwreck? Is it an intact ship buried in the sand, or has it been broken apart and its pieces scattered everywhere? So we really, at this early stage, we don't know anything about it. And so we're setting out to answer these questions. And so we basically have to dig because everything is buried. And we do that in a systematic way, in a scientific way. So instead of just kind of digging here and there and maybe finding a bunch of stuff, we really want to keep track of everything that we find. So see, we have these square grids here. This one's kind of cut off because of the fireplace. But the grid system kind of divides up our site in a systematic way. And we all know a grid system that we learned in school, X and Y, that kind of thing. But it helps us keep track of where everything is. So we'll dig in one unit at a time, 1 meter square unit at a time. And when we expose the artifacts, and we'll make a drawing of that unit. And that's why our grids have the black and white markings on them. They're marked every 10 centimeters, so that helps the diver kind of get a feel for the size of things. And of course, we have our tape measures and our folding rulers and those kind of tools as well. But sometimes it's awfully dark, and we can actually feel the black and white on the grid because we use electrical tape. So even if it's really dark and murky, we can kind of orient ourselves to the site because of our grid system. So that really helps us do this kind of thing. Yeah, this is a great video, and certainly we often have, I talked about how poor the visibility is. The video, whenever we can take good video, that means it's a banner day. That means we have some of the best visibility that we ever have. So this was a great day. There's Brendan, one of our archaeologists, saying hi. But I love it. You can see the grid system. And often our divers, I mean, we might work for weeks and weeks without actually seeing the grid system on the bottom. We're very familiar with it. It's very intimate because we are groping in the dark and we feel it, and that's how we orient ourselves to what part of the shipwreck we're on. But it's really neat that every once in a while we have the ability to see what's going on, and that kind of opens up, it kind of gives you a whole different perspective.
So a lot of the things, like in this area in particular, these are kind of everyday things that soldiers and sailors would have on board the ship. So this was a British Loyalist wreck, so they're coming from Charleston, South Carolina, and it was transporting British soldiers and British civilian Loyalists as they were evacuating Charleston towards the end of the American Revolution. And so this ship, or this wreck, has a really interesting combination of both military and civilian artifacts on it. So some of these things in here are things that would be used by sailors and soldiers that were on board that ship. So we've got some of the like rigging elements over here, hanks, hooks, iron spikes that would have been used as fasteners onto the ships. These would have been used to help run the lines on the sails.
And bits of sailcloth.
And bits of sailcloth, yeah.
That's really the most amazing
bits of sailcloth.
that has survived are these tiny, tiny fragile fragments of cloth. You don't usually get that on an archaeological site.
Right.
So that's pretty neat stuff.
Yeah, those are pretty cool. You know, we've got like the plates that they would have used. And one of my favorite things is actually the spoons themselves. And it's going to be hard to see in here, but a lot of these spoons actually have little individual marks of ownership that have been scratched into the backs of those. And that was really common with soldiers and sailors because they each had their own, you know, personal mess kit that they were responsible for, and so they would mark those spoons in some way, like scratch an X, you know, or a little design or initials or things like that to kind of differentiate between each other's spoons. And then also some of the neater artifacts over here is we have several military buttons, and these in particular have been really crucial to actually identifying what this wreck was. We've got 30th Regiment, 63rd Regiment, which actually isn't in the case right now, it's still undergoing conservation, the 71st Regiment, and then several Royal Provincial buttons. And Royal Provincials were essentially Loyalist militia units during the American Revolution. So they were part of the groups of people living in America who decided they did not want to break away from Britain, so they took up arms to fight for their side. And that was a major clue during our research of this wreck in telling us that it was indeed a Loyalist evacuation ship.
So we've got more cookware. This is a typical cooking pot. So this was, you know, your breakfast, lunch, and dinner in a colonial household. You had this pot hanging over the fire in your fireplace, and that's where a mother would have cooked the meal. So again, this is the kind of things, just everyday household things that were an ordinary part of their lives, are the things that we see on this shipwreck. And I have to say, I guess, about the cauldrons. In two of the cauldrons, so we found a lot of these things, which is not surprising because so many different families are on board this vessel and all crammed together with their stuff. But we found, I don't know, 9, 10, a dozen of these cauldrons, or broken pieces of cauldrons. But in two of them, we had tiny remains of the last meal that was prepared. So one cauldron, while we were cleaning out the inside of it, we found, believe it or not, a single green pea, a tiny little pea the size of a lentil. And there was preserved inside this cauldron, where it had last been a little bit of scrap food on the bottom of that thing that hadn't been washed out for the past 230 years. And then in another cauldron, we took the sand out of the cauldron when we unearthed it from being buried in sand on the bottom of the ocean. And we had a specialist look through that sand with a microscope, and he found a tiny, tiny piece of a fish bone, a backbone from a fish, and it had been sliced and cooked. So that was clearly, again, the remains of the food that were last cooked in that cauldron. So sometimes we get really amazing things, amazing finds on some of these kind of things. Yeah, this is one of our favorites, actually. So this is a pretty unique artifact. This is a pump. So a lead deck pump. It's made of lead. It's very heavy. Now every wooden ship would have had a bilge pump. So because wooden ships leak and water gets in, you have to pump the water out. But this is different. This one's not a bilge pump. This is a deck pump. So the purpose of this is to bring seawater into the ship. So if you have to swab the decks, or if you have a fire and you need a bucket brigade and you're filling up buckets of water, this pump would be upright, and you'd be manning the handle, and here's the spout here, so it would be spouting out water, and you could have water for doing your laundry or whatever you needed to do. Of course, you can't use fresh water for that, because that's pretty critical for drinking water. So this is a unique object. There have only been 2 of these ever found on historic shipwrecks. One a Spanish galleon, 1733, that was lost in the Florida Keys, and one of them a British warship that was lost, I think, 1770 down in South America, off Patagonia. And so it's kind of unique in its own right, but what makes this one really special is the story that it tells us about the very final moments of the ship's life. So it's giving us a picture of what was going on just at the moment of the shipwreck. And the reason we've been able to interpret that story are because of the markings on this object. And you can see them if you come close. There's a cut mark here, and you can see how it's been cut mostly in half, and they kind of twisted the lead to snap this bit off. There's some more cut marks you can't see on the other side of this object. So basically, lead's pretty soft. And so if somebody took a sword or a cutlass or an axe to this piece of equipment and cut it from the ship, Now that seems kind of crazy. Why would you take what is undoubtedly a pretty expensive piece of equipment, you know, a piece of technology that's pretty important on board a sailing ship? Why would you remove it in such a crude fashion, in a way that actually disables it? Because obviously you can't use the pump anymore if it's been cut clean through, and there's a hole in the body of the pump, so it could no longer pump water without extensive repairs. Well, the reason that this was done, and it's the only reason we can come up with, but we're pretty sure that this explains it, is you have to remember this ship had just run aground. So this ship, it didn't sink in deep water at sea like the Titanic. This ship was trying to get in through the St. Augustine Inlet, and it ran into a sandbar. And this kind of thing happened over and over again in St. Augustine. We were known for being one of the most dangerous inlets because of our sandbar moving around, shifting around with every storm. So this ship ran hard aground. It was going probably at a brisk pace, and all of a sudden it just stopped. And so spars and blocks and pulleys and things fell from the sails above, and it was been crazy. Everything was falling over, tumbling over on the ship, and then everybody realized they were in trouble. This ship is not moving. So the only way to save the ship is to try to get it off the sandbar, and the way to do that is to get excess weight off the ship. And this was one of the first things to go. This thing is heavy, it's hundreds of pounds, and it was hacked apart with an axe. The plumbing on it was folded so that two sailors could grab it and throw it overboard. And so this was kind of an example of those last frantic moments trying to save this ship before they realized that indeed this ship was a total loss and that everybody was going to lose all of their possessions and arrive destitute here in St. Augustine. Yeah, the cannon's the exact same example, and these were found right next to each other. And the cannons, this is 1 out of 7 cannons. 6 of them were all in a pile, basically. They were all kind of lying down like pickup sticks, and right next to each other, kind of as if they just spilled out of the ship. So what we think happened is the same thing we have evidence for on the deck pump, that the cannons were thrown overboard one by one when the ship was hard aground, and they all landed more or less on top of each other in a small area, and that's exactly where they've stayed. You know, the winds and the waves have moved a lot of the smaller objects around on our shipwreck as the sand erodes away and the storms come through and there's surge underwater, same surge that throws us divers around sometimes down there. But the cannons are pretty heavy, so they stayed more or less in one spot, just like this object, the deck pump as well. So that seems pretty clear to us that that's what was going on. There was an attempt to save this ship. June 28, 2011 was the day that we brought up 2 cannons. This long gun you see here, which is a 4-pounder, that means it fired a 4-pound cannonball. And then we had a smaller version of a cannon known as a carronade, and that was a 9-pounder, more powerful gun, pretty high-tech piece of artillery. And that one's not yet on display here in the exhibit, but it will be. We're just finishing the final stages of treatment for it. So on that day, I mean, it was amazing. We had people come from all over the place. We had reporters, we had museum VIPs, we had donors, we had a lot of the staff there with us, and then we had our university students who were studying archaeology with us. And on that morning, this cannon, which had not seen the light of day for 230 years, was slowly brought up out of the green, murky water and then bathed in sunlight for the first time in centuries. And you can imagine.
But it is still a really, really interesting artifact. And when you kind of combine it with the other things that we're finding on the site, like the 2 cannons that we found, for example, or that we recovered, you know, neither of those cannons had any sort of like government mark on them, like a crown or a seal or a British broad arrow or anything like that. And so that's usually kind of indicative that they were on a privately owned vessel. And that also agrees with the fact that we have an unmarked bell, because it was fairly uncommon for privately owned merchant vessels to pay the extra cash that it would take to get a custom cast bell. It was kind of an expensive thing. And so the fact that we have this combination of things that are unmarked kind of reinforces the idea that we have this privately owned vessel, which is kind of interesting since we're finding all this military evidence on it. So that kind of led us down the road that we do believe we have this privately owned vessel that was hired by the Royal Navy as a military transport because they didn't have enough ships within their fleet to get everybody evacuated all at once. They were hiring these extra ships as well.
You've seen it live, you've seen it on Periscope, you should come see it in real life next. If you're anywhere close to St. Augustine, come see the exhibit. There's nothing like seeing these things right in front of you.